I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and extend a special welcome to any First Nations people who might be joining us today. I'm coming to you from Gunai-Kurnai country in southeast Australia. We're going to be quite a small group today, so please don't hesitate to introduce yourselves via the chat and tell us a bit about you and where you're coming from. So just to briefly explain the format that we've got here today for you, I'm going to shortly hand over to Dr. Mirjana Prekar, who is the president of the Global TCI Network, for some introductory words, and she'll formally introduce our guest speaker, Dr. John Howard, who we're thrilled to have with us today. So this is not going to be a formal presentation on the contents of John's recently launched book. The session will be largely conversational and interview style. As your moderator, I'll be asking John some questions, and I encourage you also to pose questions in the chat. As you can see, the session is being recorded and we'll make it available to you after the session. So Mirjana, I'll hand over to you just to tell everyone a little bit about TCI and the background to this webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicola, and greetings. And it's great to be here today. And thank you for the kind introduction. It's great to see some familiar faces. Hello, Tracy. It's nice to see you again.
Hey.
I know, it's been a while. But as the president of the TCI Network and chair of the Oceania Chapter of TCI Network, I'm really delighted to be part of the conversation with Dr. John Howard, or John as I know him, and his great Handbook of Innovation Ecosystems, Placemaking, Economics, Business and Governance. If you don't have a copy, I strongly encourage you to get one because it's fantastic, and I think it's the golden thread to what we need to do in this country and many other places around the world. Before we begin, I'd just like to share a bit about TCI. Some of you may be familiar with the TCI network, and for those that don't, the organisation is the leading global network of people and organisations working in clusters and innovation ecosystems around the globe. And in fact, we're over in 100 countries, and we have many people who are practitioners on the ground. We work across 3 pillars. We share knowledge, we facilitate global connections, and we build capabilities of stakeholders to advance sustainable clusters and ecosystems. We were founded in 1998 based on the back of the great work being done by Michael Porter, who's a patron of the network. And we are a unique international community of cluster practitioners that convene dynamic and collaborative dialogue and forums across the triple helix, and through innovation address some of the societal complex challenges. We build competitiveness and we create inclusive ecosystems. Our foundational conference that we have every year was based in Ireland, and for those of you that were there, it was a great meeting of minds. But what it also did was it highlighted the importance of clusters and how they are helping to address challenges and are facilitating economic growth, expanding investment opportunities, and encouraging greater innovation and technology transfer. On Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, which is the Prime Minister of Ireland, highlighted the important role of clusters and an open economy. And he also stressed that they are the engines of growth for the island of Ireland. And this is the first time that a head of country has formally endorsed clusters and ecosystems. And it's quite an exciting time, I think, in this era of challenges that we have. We also heard that at the heart of sustaining open economies are open and collaborative approaches and the transformative potential of collaboration across many dimensions, which is really critical at a time when our world is facing many complex challenges. The need for working together across boundaries, organisational, cultural and geographic, to achieve shared goals has never been greater than what it is today. We are going to hear today from Dr. John Howard, Executive Director of the Acton Institute for Policy Research and Innovation, and who's also an honorary visiting professor at the University of Technology of Sydney. John brings decades of invaluable experience spanning universities, business and government on innovation policy and regional development. We know that John is the author of this great handbook that I just highlighted, and it was published late last year. And the discussion today will draw on the analysis of more than 90 innovation ecosystems globally and he will share his 4-domain convergence model. He's currently leading a UTS Google org research project examining how innovation ecosystems quality explains AI productivity outcomes across global innovation districts. John, we are very much looking forward to understanding how the 4-domain convergence model can create thriving and sustainable ecosystems. Nicola, I'll hand back to you to start the conversation with John.
Thanks very much, Mariana. And yes, I have my copy here, which provided some light reading over the summer. So today we're not asking John to give a formal presentation on the book itself because everybody can actually read that for themselves, but we will obviously be doing a bit of a deeper dive into many of the themes. So as I mentioned, I'm going to kick off by asking John some questions. And our intention with these kind of forums is to make them as conversational and as relevant for the participants as possible. So I'd encourage you, if you've got burning questions, to pop them in the chat. But as we are such a small group, I think towards the end we can probably just open up for some general conversation, because this is also about kind of building connections and building relationships as we all struggle with these complex disruptive times. So if everyone's okay with that, John, let's kick off. And I'd like to begin by asking you, when you wrote this book, what problem were you trying to solve? What problem were you trying to solve when you wrote the Handbook of Innovation Ecosystems? And for you, what was missing in the existing thinking?
Let's just start by saying thanks, Nicola and Mariana, for those nice introductions. I just might add that about 50% of the sales have been international, which in the UK, Europe, particularly Germany, also the US. So quite pleased with that result, and I think it's created a fair bit of discussion and commentary, which we see a bit on LinkedIn and through our own website. But so, what was the problem I was trying to solve, and what was missing? So, the short version of that is, I guess, that I've been intrigued by place-based innovation for a long time, and how they actually work. Ever since I completed a PhD thesis on the triple helix concept, I was impressed by what it spoke about as the interaction between the three pillars of universities, government, and business. And it sounded all very good and logical, and it still does, of course. But what intrigued me, and still does, is that how do they actually connect? How does it actually work? What flows through the pipes and wires that people love drawing and putting in their various frameworks. So but I've also got this fundamental interest in innovation ecosystems and how they work and operate, and particularly as a departure from the conventional wisdom of the linear flow of science to innovation. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But it's really, when we're thinking about innovation ecosystems, we need to think about not only how well they work, but, as Mark Dodson says, where are the system failures? And as coming back from a policy perspective, which I think is a bit of a blockage for a lot of policymakers, is where do you make the interventions, and which ones are going to have the greatest impact. So that's it's a short potted history of what's the interest, and I still don't have all the answers, if you like, but the diagram was a way of seeing a bit of light, I suppose, and distilling it, and that came to light I guess, when sitting here at UTS and I was looking over the road at Tech Central and saying, well, what's this all about? How does it work? And how does it deliver value? And then that was the stimulus for coming up with the four domain framework, because when I heard the minister talking about Tech Central, all he could talk about was placemaking. Then if you listen to others, you'll think it's all about property development. It's about buildings and maximising an ROI. So that's the property developer perspective, if you like. But there's also the economics one, which comes from a long tradition of agglomeration effects and spillover benefits. As Miranda said, a lot of that goes back to Michael Porter, but even to Alfred Marshall before that. And then it's the businesses that are involved in it, which is the established businesses. Why do they come there? Why do they stay? And we have a bit of an obsession with startups and how important they are to ecosystems. And reflecting my public administration background, I guess, is, well, how do they work? How do they get together? And what are the mechanisms for that? There's quite a bit of coverage on that in the book, and there's a question that comes up a bit later. Where we can return to. So I'll leave it there, and you've got another question, Nicola.
Yeah, no, thanks, John, and I guess just to kind of reinforce that point, particularly with some of the introductions to your book, it's also kind of really highlighting that there's almost an imperative to do this, because productivity levels in Australia continue to tank. Our ranking on the Global Innovation Index is always stagnant, and economic complexity, our performance there is also really, really poor. So it's highlighting almost that imperative for this conversation.
My friend Roy Green will talk at length about that whenever the opportunity arises. But the message is
Tracy
getting
nodding.
Sorry?
I can see Tracy, who knows Roy well, nodding.
But I think the message is getting through. Started to be reflected in the language of Tim Watts and many others. So I think that's we are making progress. We'll come back to that at the end.
Great. So just in relation to these four interdependent domains: placemaking, economics, business, and governance, why is it important to treat these as co-equal and not hierarchical or independent?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, but I think it comes back to what I was saying a minute ago, that the temptation is to privilege economics or technology, but developers that prioritise buildings, for example. But we also know that investing heavily in research without addressing governance will get you excellent science trapped inside institutions that can't translate the discoveries. Again, the ecosystem environment is seen as vital for that issue of translating in research outcomes and technology into application and use, which is innovation. There's no mystery about what innovation is. It's, as Mark Dodson would say, ideas successfully applied, and I'll sort of endorse that. You don't have an innovation unless it's adopted, applied, and used. That's my 3-word slogan, which I've had for years and years. But also, there's the issue you can create very attractive precincts without business development capability, and they become consumption destinations rather than production hubs. And we see that a lot in the town planning discussions and conversations about placemaking. And Committee for Sydney, for example, is interested in the broader concept, but also it markets Sydney as a place for tourism and for inward investment attraction. So it's this multi-policy perspective, which, from a public policy point of view, makes it particularly interesting for someone like me, because there's no one answer. In a lot of public policy, there isn't a single answer, but it's a matter of coming up with the approaches that create value, not just the economy, but broader concepts of economic and social value. And that conversation, I'm not quite sure that we gave that enough priority in the book. We did. There's a section or two that does, but I actually spent a fair bit of time working with the Council of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, and wrote a couple of papers on innovation in arts and creative practice, and that starts another narrative, if you like, about the interaction of technology and design, which we quite often overlook, and we don't invest enough in Australia. We don't invest enough in design. So, but just to round that off, when you look across the 90 districts and precincts, it's very consistent that the high-performing ecosystems have succeeded because they aligned all four dimensions with it. And what's just a final point there is that I needed to put the platform of infrastructure there. It doesn't always get represented, but without the infrastructure investment, the rest of it just doesn't hang together as a concept. It was Sharath Saram who made me aware of that, and in leading up to the book.
So great, thanks, John. Yeah, and just for those who've been coming in a little bit late, I'm encouraging everyone to pose questions in the chat, and I'll try to weave them in or address them at the end. But there's probably just one of the comments that you made then, John. There's a question in the chat, which is asking, in this model, is research represented in the underpinning infrastructure part? So you mentioned the infrastructure. So the question is research represented in that? And what role perhaps does it play?
The quick answer to that is that it's directly related to the creation of knowledge capital. These ecosystems are built on a foundation of knowledge, and knowledge in its dimensions, discovery, application, integration, and so on. So yes, fundamentally, research is part of that, part of the knowledge capital, which is identified there.
So we'll just kind of linking back to what we know about our performance on the Global Innovation Index, which shows that we're really strong on the inputs, but they're not actually translating into outputs. So it seems that many policymakers still think that innovation outcomes can actually be funded into existence. You challenge what you call the input fallacy. Can you just unpack that a little bit more for us?
I think there's a couple of dimensions to that, but when you look at the context of science, research, innovation policy, a lot of the measures are around inputs, level of R&D, patents, papers, and so on, which are basically inputs to achieving an outcome. And there's an assumption, and that comes together in the concept of the linear flow. Start with research, start putting money into research, and it goes through a process, and by magic, you get innovation. Now, that's been challenged for years and years. No one really thinks that's the way it works, but it's very easy, and politicians relate to it, to actually put up this diagram and then talk about the valley of death and so on, which incidentally I've argued isn't just financial, it's fundamentally a management issue. But it's very, but I said that the concept's persisted because the presentation, because it's a good presentation. And even a fellow I knew quite well in the Department of Industry used to say to us that it persists because politicians like to refer to it. And to them, it is a way of understanding representing the innovation process rather than representing the innovation ecosystem or system. And I think it's and it's also I suppose my mission is to shift the intention from inputs to the system conditions that determine how our outputs are absorbed. And I mentioned that a minute ago. A little mantra about adoption, application, and use. Okay, that's a short way of saying absorptive capacity, which people have written about extensively. So yes, focusing on inputs, not outcomes, and fundamentally, outcome is change. And there's one of the chapters in the book talks about that. So and that we usually think of change for the better, change in one aspect of the economy or society or our cultural institutions. But of course, change can have downsides as well. And one of the chapters talks about dark innovation, which quite often lacks the sort of attention that it should have. But we can talk more length about that.
Yeah. So just looking again at this framework, and kind of linking back into policy as well, and your research across these 90 case studies, where do you see ecosystems most commonly falling out of balance across these four domains? Which is the critical area or the critical areas that you see are failing?
I guess I'd point to three areas, which I've touched on, which the knowledge versus capability gap. So we've got universities and research organisations generate discoveries and inventions, but the ecosystem lacks the management expertise to cross this management chasm. There's been a couple of innovation insights on that topic over the last few weeks, because I've never accepted that it's money only, and providing more money won't necessarily guarantee that the outcomes are delivered. The second one is placemaking without purpose, attractive precincts that become property developments branded as innovation districts. And we see a fair bit of that. A nice property development will have innovation tacked on the end, and at the risk of sounding disingenuous, quite often that adds value to the properties being developed. But the other side of that argument, when you look at something like Parramatta Square, that is largely a property development, very much about placemaking, creating an environment that encourages people to meet and interact and collaborate. But the innovation is starting to happen, and also Western Sydney University is also in Parramatta Square. But the organisations, and a lot of them are government organisations in Parramatta Square, are thinking very much about innovation. Again, you've got and a lot of that's probably being facilitated by the university. The other one is the governance imbalance. So governance can be either too prescriptive, stifling experimentation, or too absent, disconnected agendas. And again, using Sydney as the closest example, we've had innovation districts in various forms of over 25 years. If we go back to think of the Australian Technology Park, it wasn't run by the participants, it was run by the Sydney Foreshores Authority. And they had their ideas, I suppose, on what should be done in the place. And we see that tendency in government to want to control things. And my argument, again, from that public administration perspective, we need to be resisting that.
So just drilling down on that critical governance point that you've mentioned, what do we need to be doing differently there, do you think? What does strong governance, governance across an innovation ecosystem actually look like? And what are the structural features that might differentiate those governance arrangements from some of the ones we commonly see today?
I think that relates to more generally to governance frameworks in public policy, and organisation and policies work best when there's a combination of strategic direction and operational flexibility. So that means in an innovation ecosystem, what I've argued about before is dedicated systems integrators that coordinate and ensure collaboration across domains and maintain strategic coherence. And collaboration is a word we're hearing a lot more from the Commonwealth Government about how we build outcomes into our very complex research system. And I know that the strategic examination of R&D exercises is looking at collaboration very closely. It differs from program management. So your key governance feature is that it facilitates connections, identifies gaps, and resolves tensions, rather than the directing and controlling, so I refer to. And there are numerous examples how an integrative governance arrangement can actually work across the 80 systems.
I must confess
we might
that,
come back to that. I'll get you asking the question.
No, that's fine, and I just want to pick up on that ecosystem orchestration role, because we're seeing a lot of different terms emerging now: system integrator, system orchestrator, cluster facilitator, and it's probably a role that I've been playing in my own professional capacity for many years. But it is just perhaps not so well understood, that role. So, is there a capable, so it is around this kind of leadership capacity as well. Do we need a new professional discipline around ecosystem orchestration?
I think it's just returning to my earlier comment about program management operating in defined boundaries and scope budgets. And then I'd argue that orchestration operates across boundaries where no single actor has control or dominates. And in the book, I refer to the jazz combo idea, that if you watch if you watch the big bands that used to operate in the 30s and 40s, but more recently a jazz band at a club or a venue. You've got a leader, but he or she, the leader enables rather than directs, breaking the relationship and maintaining coherence. And I'm sort of firmly committed, I suppose, over many years to the idea of that orchestration. And I was thinking about, I always like to think of parallels. And I think it was last Friday, we were at the Brandenburg Orchestra concert here in Sydney. And what was really impressive and noteworthy is that the leader, Paul Dyer, actually operated as very much as a facilitator. He wasn't a conductor. He didn't stand there with a baton and point and direct. He basically, you could see him bringing out the best in the musicians and the way they interacted. And you could also see how the musicians were actually enjoying the performance, and you could see that in the body language and the vibes. And that, to me, was a fantastic example of how orchestration works. And we can translate this and these sort of perceptions into how innovation ecosystems work. So the orchestrator is very much a leader, not a conductor, if you like, or controller, as you say, Nicola. And I think that's, but it also requires a bit of political acuity and knowing and having comfort with ambiguity, and also being patient. And a lot of patience is required in any collaborative framework. The tendency also always in an organisation is to say, look, we've had enough of this. We want to achieve an outcome, and I want to take control. And that's where it starts to break down.
Thanks, John. So I might just, I'm just looking at a couple of the questions that are in the chat here. I'm going to go to Brendan's. What models of governance do you think work best to drive innovation outcomes? And have you seen effective ways in which all participants in innovation precincts can play a role in governance? And perhaps when you respond to that question, just making or looking at the relationship between the governance function and the system, the ecosystem orchestrator, if you like.
I think I mentioned collaborative governance, and I think the academic reference to that comes from the theory of clubs, which is how concept of clubs work as collaborative ventures to achieve particular outcomes and results. And I used to be a vice commodore of a yacht club, for example, and you couldn't achieve anything through command and control, but you could achieve it through putting in place collaborative frameworks. And my role, if you like, and in any club, is the person in charge is really the leader and the orchestrator of what happens. There's ways of doing that in a structural sense, and in a couple of places around the world, they've set up registered associations. I forget the word for it here, but that was one of the options being looked at here in Sydney. But I know that Kendall Square works on that collaborative association framework. The collaborations can be totally unstructured, which is relying on a lot of goodwill, and which is what you see in networks. Network governance does create problems. At the end of the day, looking at one particular ecosystem, Victoria will have a network making decisions, but when it comes to finances, someone's got to be responsible and accountable. And so that's what I'm saying is you're building a bridge between a networked organisation, if you like, and a formal organisation, and finding the middle ground and finding the situation and circumstances where that's going to actually work. And again, the organisation theory is that there's a lot of experimentation dealing with the ambiguity, and also agility, and that requires particular types of people and personalities, and particularly and the strongest capabilities, I think, as you mentioned, Nicola, is one of leadership. It's come back to the point. It's about leadership, not command and control. And I think the results in Kendall Square sort of speak for themselves.
Yeah. Brendan, feel free to chip in here. Has that adequately answered your question?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, John. Thank you.
And I guess, John, what you're talking about there is, touching over into other areas of discourse as well, relating to, the notion of umbrella organisations and collective leadership concepts, and, but it's certainly, alluding to very different ways of organising to the traditional organizational governance frameworks that are often in place today. It's a very different model for ecosystems.
Yeah, that's right. I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I think that because we're looking at systems which have got a very heavy government involvement, there's always a tendency, which I've alluded for governments to want to have build bureaucratic structures, and in I won't name the state or the territory, but going along many years ago, it was quite common to listen to a presentation on innovation, and the first slide that went up was along the lines, "This is our structure," and so in management thinking, we know that strategy drives structure, but there's still a tendency for people in the public sector to think about structure first, rather than getting the job done. And as Peter Drucker, wrote, the best structure is the one that does the job. So we've got to think about delivery and implementation rather than getting the structure right.
So I might try to weave in your question here, Mick. Mick's asked the question around, made the statement, innovation outputs are implicit in the model. Should we be more explicit in highlighting what they are to highlight our purpose, objectives, and impact? So how does that link into governance and setting strategic direction and that kind of operational flexibility that you mentioned earlier?
Nicola, could I just expand on that and explain? And good afternoon, everyone. Just thrilled to be engaged in this seminar. It's really satisfying to see the concepts that we're talking about really front and center, etc. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, John. But that goes to the next point, that many of us on the seminar are converted. And we are preaching to the converted. My consideration or overriding frustration and challenge then is how we mainstream these concepts both in government and with politicians, etc. So then we talk about communication, and the question here is the audience for this particular slide, which I think is just profound and really valuable. And then the question of whether we can improve it for external audiences who may not be converted, who don't understand what we mean by innovation, and means many things to many people, and there are lots of skeptics out there about innovation. So then that goes to my question about, could we be more explicit about what we mean by innovation and what are the benefits and what is our objective in all of this?
Thanks, Mick.
Sorry. As I'll come back to my point, and thanks for the question, Mick. It's very thought-provoking, which is good. But as I come back to the point that innovation is about change, and I agree that the concept is a contested one, and I enjoyed reading Bernard Godin's book about innovation contested, which is that thick. And it traces it from the 1500s, and people used to be burned for talking about innovation because it meant revolution, and those two we still see those terms in the conversations, like disruptive innovation and so on, but. It is, as I say, keep coming back to it, it's about change. But I think you're absolutely right. We need to be specific about what sort of change we want and how innovation is actually going to deliver that. The most obvious one is, alluding back to Nicola's comments, is that we want change in our economic environment that addresses the if you like, addresses our poor ratings in the complexity index, our poor track record in research commercialisation, and so on. So that's the economic outcome, if you like, that we're seeking. And I think that's about very much about productivity. And I think that's important because it does actually provide a focus for what we're trying to do. And similarly, Miranda alluded to that project we're doing for the Google Foundation and with UTS. It's very much identifying how AI can actually deliver in lifting the productivity outcomes. So that's a separate conversation. But in that case, it's very clear what Google's clients are, not their own clients in terms of the foundation, not their practice, what they consider to be a desirable outcome for the economy and for society, because productivity delivers benefits right throughout the political culture and society as well. So it's not just innovation in economics; it's innovation in the social cultural institutions and outcomes. And it's, to me, that's when I think about the arts and culture, and you go along to performances and you look at the sorts of innovations which are enhancing the performances or the experience of the audience at those events. And I think there's a last chapter in the book talks about the experience, and so it's very much the innovation or the innovations with the technologies that are in those venues are actually delivering an experience, if you like, for the people who want to go along and enjoy the theatre and also the experience. I guess that's a very roundabout response, but what I'm trying to do to answer your question is try and articulate the outcomes that innovation can actually deliver and where it can be valued. And we see it in tourism. You go to a hotel not because you want accommodation, you want the experience of being there. And if you look behind it, what's the things that are improving that experience are very much innovation at work.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Mirjana, did you just want to chip in, because you've made a comment here that the logic framework should underpin the implementation of the strategy. Did you want to just chip in and make a brief comment there?
It's really to touch on the fact that the logic framework looks at all your inputs and your processes and your outputs, and then what's the impact. So it's a fantastic framework that it actually underpins your strategy. And John, you said an important thing. It's about the implementation. So a lot of people get unstuck. How do you design your initiatives, your programs, and a whole range of things? Well, this is a framework that allows you to do that, because it allows you to go back up again and say, well, are we answering the strategic intent of what we're trying to achieve? And so that framework is invaluable. And as an industry growth centre, we implemented that to look at what were the inputs and how did the outputs and processes lead to the outcomes that we delivered through the industry growth centres. So I just wanted to highlight, because people are touching on inputs, and I think, John, you said also too, it's not just about the consumption, it's also about the production as well. And what are the flows throughout the ecosystem of the resources or the inputs that you're enabling to deliver the outcome are really important.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
And I think what you're highlighting there, Mirjana, is there are existing tools like logic frameworks that kind of get out of just immediate project or program management, but can embed specific projects and programs, but within that broader design framework that we're potentially looking for here.
But it's also to make sure that you're understanding you can get very busy pretty quickly as an integrator across the ecosystem. And so therefore the question is, what's your greatest impact? And I think this allows you to do that in a structured way. So and also you can understand that, because one of the things they all struggle with is financial viability. How do you keep these organisations sustainable to be able to continue to support the ecosystem? But I'll pause and let you continue, Nicola.
And not losing sight of purpose, which is what John has been reinforcing, that core purpose or mission-driven, whatever we want to call it. Yeah.
And that comes down to a simple statement. What are we here to do and achieve? There's nothing particularly complicated about that.
not uncommon for that to completely get lost, though, sometimes.
Sure. Yep.
Well, just picking up on that, I think also what Mick has highlighted, that yes, many of the people on this call are already amongst the well converted, and particularly, as we know, across Oceania, Australia, we do need to see some policy interventions. So, you argue that innovation is as much about is as much an institutional or organisational design challenge as a funding challenge. What changes do you think governments most urgently need to make?
I think it comes back to a question about the questions you've got there about it's about a frame of mind in the part of ministers and governments, and in this area that what I'd like to see happen is ministers stop announcing new programs before evaluating the previous ones, and choose a direction and commit to it for a long time. I mean, I'm not sure I mentioned it in the seminar, but being in Sydney and watching what's going on in the innovation space is just a continuous stream of announcements. And it also happens in the AC. Sorry, just had a strange visitor. Sorry, I just lost my thread there. And also they need to stop treating R&D as the primary lever, when in fact the pathway is actually blocked by coordination failures and that more funding can't fix. And I guess that's a problem that, or an issue that the Commonwealth government has. It doesn't have many policy levers, and its main policy lever is the financial one. It raises taxation and it can make grants of financial assistance, but it doesn't control residential property development. It doesn't control zoning, all those land use issues that go with this. So that means making sure there's a strong level of cooperation and collaboration with the states and local government. So, and what can they do? Start building system integrated capacity and capabilities. And I guess that comes back to another issue that you've raised in the questions, Nicola, is that you talk about the capability gap in ecosystem leadership. Do we need a new discipline? Well, the answer is probably yes and no. We already have the interdisciplinary area of innovation studies, which I work in and a lot of my colleagues work in. But it's actually recognising that as a discipline which others can commit to in an institutional sense, so that and it's also an understanding that if we're thinking about the training and development, the ecosystem leadership requires integration across domains, typically taught separately. So we have people skilled in urban planning, economics, business management, public administration, and the education and training aspects of that tend to be run separately in universities and colleges, and that's really disappointing. Which also leads on to what we really need is better mechanisms such as structured learning, peer networks, career pathways that value this integration capacity. And in other forums I've spoken about the four domains of scholarship, which are like discovery, integration, application, and teaching. What gets less attention in Australia particularly is the scholarship of integration. We do well in discovery, we do well in doing better in application, but we're not building that integrated discipline around what Boyer called the Scholarship of Integration. I can give you references to that, but it's called, there's a little book, nice little book called Scholarship Reconsidered, which are very popular in the US and elsewhere, but it didn't get much traction in Australia, or doesn't get much traction in Australia.
And I'll just flag that the points that you're making there are a very live conversation, aren't they, Mariana, that we're having in TCI at the moment around whether there is a need to recognise the capabilities of those system orchestrators, or whatever we want to call them, because at the moment they're not understood, they're not recognised, so therefore they're not valued, and therefore they're not invested in either. So it's really how we overcome that. So that's probably a separate question, and I am really mindful of time because it is slipping away. So I'm going to ask you one more question. And if anyone's got some other burning ones, which I've overlooked, Brendan, I think you've got one there. But John, if you were advising a minister tomorrow, what would you tell them to stop doing and start doing right now? Because this is kind of what we need, and they need to be in the ear of some of our ministers, politicians, and policymakers.
I made a couple of points about that a minute ago, but I think it's a question about what gives me optimism. But and there's a few points there I shall go into. But I think it comes back to the greatest message, I suppose, to get across is around that realisation that the ecosystems have the greatest potential to impact on productivity, and that. As I said, although this is narrowly economistic, it may be the lever that we need to be working with to develop the potential for innovation ecosystems to deliver a broader concept of value. And I think I'm optimistic about how we move ahead. That there is a recognition that the fragmented approach that Roy Green and I talk about in the way we run the system, that's failing, and the conceptual battle that convincing people that systems thinking that's largely been won. And we can look at genuine convergence in a number of places around the world. And I'll come back to the point that we need to be making the point of the need to invest in capable people emerging in innovation ecosystem leadership, who understand what systems are all about and ecosystems are all about, and learning from each other through networks like TCI. There's a bit of, and I agree what your concluding comment last, Nicole. I think TCI has got a vital role in this space.
Thank you. And we might need to work on that beautiful response there, John, into a simple elevator pitch for politicians, because we know, they need things in short, simple bites. But I just having Steve, thank you, Christopher, for your comments there. Tracy, thank you. I'll treat that also as a comment, if that's okay.
Look, great comment, Nicola. Now you're talking, Tracy.
Yeah, we need to encourage some networking there. I'm just
sure
wondering.
There's a hook.
So
I'm sure there's a hook we could use. Sorry, Nicola.
I'm just wondering, because we've got a really big team on board from the Randwick Health and Innovation Precinct team. Just wondering whether there's any questions or reflections from your side before we wrap up, because obviously we're dealing with a lot of systemic complexity and across multiple different sectors. Did you guys want to chip in something without putting you on the spot?
Yeah, sorry, my name's Tim Regan. Thank you very much, John and everyone today for the call. Look, I'm sharp there. I suppose there are elements that really do apply to us, which is definitely placemaking and governance. And I think business, we put business down as perhaps as our partners. We've got the university, the health district, and the children's hospital. Although we are trying to attract commercial businesses as well as the precinct grows out. But the economics one's really quite interesting. I hadn't thought about that as much. And I think that's where for us, although some of our partners might have money or incentives to get people on site, it's somewhere that we need to work closely with the New South Wales government. And there could be other people here on the call as well. But, incentives, etc., would be about the government looking to bring people to Team Australia, to bringing them to New South Wales and thinking that for us, Randwick would be the best place for them to be. So, yeah, that's an area, I suppose, John, that I'll explore a little bit more as the economics with incentives markets and resource flows.
Thanks, Renee. And look, I'm always one to hate chopping off rich conversations, and there's so much more we could go into depth here, but we want to kind of stick to our original timeline. So I'm just going to thank you, John, so much. There's so much in your book, and we all really value the insights that you're sharing, particularly on LinkedIn. Mirjana, can I just pass over to you very, very quickly for some closing comments, reflections?
Absolutely. And I was going to say, if the group's quite interested, why don't we regroup, Nicola, and continue the conversation? Because I think a lot of people have got food for thought, and I think let's have another discussion following on from this webinar, because I think there's been really valuable discussions already taking place. But I wanted to just recap on, and John, look, it's been phenomenal hearing what you've got to say. But I think, what we do know, as you said, the fragmented approach isn't working. So what we know, what got us here is not going to get us to the future. So we know we've got to change. And I think that's really important. But I think also, too, what you've also highlighted is, the greatest potential we have on productivity is actually through ecosystem and systems thinking. So I think we've got a framework, and we should be using it in an approach. But I think, as Nicola, you said, and I think it's really important at the outset, you've got to know what you're trying to achieve. What are you trying to do? And I think that purpose is really your steer. We heard also that innovation is about change. It's about adoption, and it's non-linear. We've got a framework that John, having looked at a number of precincts and districts around the world, there are 4 domains that converge, and there's a model. They're all critical, and they're underpinned by the infrastructure, which is really essential. What we do know is that alignment of all the elements is important. You can't forget one and not at the expense of the other, and they're really important to building a high-performing ecosystem. Strategic direction is important, but you also need to have the operational flexibility to navigate the changing landscape, which is forever, as we are seeing, complex and evolving. We need to understand the inputs and how they are absorbed in the ecosystem, the absorptive capacity, as John refers to. And there's a logic framework, which is a useful tool to be able to put a bit of structure and how you link it back up to the strategy and what you're trying to achieve. But I think the most fundamental thing, which I think is really essential, is the facilitators, orchestrators, or integrators, which are I call it the soft infrastructure, John. But I think the investment in these people is really important as they operate across the boundaries. They are leaders. They must deal with ambiguity. They have to have political nous. They need to have the patience and agility to really navigate and help deliver really impactful results. So thank you, John. Nicola, I'm not sure if there's anything else that you want to add, but I think it's been a fantastic discussion.
Okay, thank you. I have to go. Someone's in the room. Okay, thank you.
That's fine. Thank you so much, John, and thank you, everybody. I think the point that you made, Mirjana, I'll be sending out a follow-up email to everybody who's been online today, and if you've got further comments, feedback on how you would like to continue the conversation, we'd love to hear from it, because I think we are all learning in this space and how we collectively learn together. is really, really important. But also, to Mick's point, also is how we have a stronger collective voice in this space to, really get more policy support for working across ecosystems more effectively for collective impact. So thank you again, everybody. Really appreciated your input. I hope it was worthwhile pausing on your sandwiches, and we'll look forward to catching up again soon.